Father Benedict McGlinchey, thank you very much for joining me today. The second Dominican to come through these hallowed halls
Yeah,
in
that's
recent
always good.
times.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah, and I mean, it was interesting because I'd spoken, Connor had mentioned, obviously I went to Evangelium, which you're the spiritual director of as well.
Yeah,
And I mentioned that you have a very interesting story yourself in terms of your becoming a Dominican friar. And I wondered, like, what's your background with
yeah,
Catholicism, like before you were ordained, and like what made you, take that decision and pursue the religious life? Might be a good place
yeah.
to start.
It's a fairly long story, man, but I'll try and kind of hit
Well,
the
we've got time. We've got
hit,
time.
hit the main point. I suppose. Yeah. I mean, I entered the order. I was in my 30s, later 30s when I entered the order. So I'd grown up as a Catholic. My family are Catholics. I'm from the north coast of Northern Ireland in County Derry.
Mhm.
Um, and I suppose I'm old enough to remember, I guess, the tail end of Catholic Ireland, I guess you can say. When I was younger, mass attendance would have been extremely high in my local parish. You would have had thousands of people on a Sunday.
Wow.
So it was still that sort of quite a religious culture. The area I'm from is predominantly Protestant, so the Protestant people would have been quite observant as well. And so some of my family is predominantly Catholic, some are Protestant. So I guess I grew up in that type of environment. But even then, you could see the cracks that were there in terms of what was to come, in terms of the decline of the church, because you could see that although mass attendance was very high and it looked good on the outside, knowing it from the inside, you could see that a lot of it was surface devotion, if you like, or surface commitment to faith. So I suppose that was my whole sort of background, was kind of in that sort of environment. School was the same, and pretty much everyone I grew up with no exceptions that I can really think of as a teenager anyway, was from a practicing Christian background, whether practicing Catholics or they were practicing Protestants, I guess, for the most part. So that was, I suppose, the backdrop. But you became aware of a lot of I suppose, the bigger issues that were going on as well. And I started to think about those issues when I was, I guess, about 17, because I took part in this. It's a thing. Senator Gordon Wilson, if you remember him or ever heard of him, he was a senator in the Irish Senate, and his daughter Mary had been killed in the Enniskillen bombing. So he had sort of set up this kind of project. I think it was designed to kind of identify leaders in Northern Ireland and get them to know each other from different sides of the community. So I went
Mhm.
to Latvia, Russia and Latvia, as part of that kind of thing. And there, for the first time in my life, I was really challenged by people that were not Christians, basically. So it wasn't so much the people from Ireland; it was the people that were from. There was an English group that joined us as well. So
Really.
I met there some really great people who were atheists, really, and agnostics. And it really challenged me, because it was the first time in my life that I had ever seriously had to defend my faith. And I sort of found that I couldn't, actually. I had a very good upbringing. It was very kind of happy in the sense of faith and all of that. But it lacked any type of intellectual kind of aspect to it. It was primarily ethical, in the sense that you behave well, you treat people well, and that's all good. But when it came
Mhm.
to having these debates, when I was 17, turning 18, with people that they were a bit older, in fairness, but I really didn't have the answers, and it really caused me to start thinking. And I think it sort of caused then I suppose, a crisis of faith, because I had to, for the first time, really think about, is this actually what I believe? So that was, I suppose, then my upper sixth, my final year in school, and then I went to Trinity to study law, and that sort of thing then happened again, because again I was back in an environment where the majority of people, or I don't know if it was a majority, but certainly a large number of people that I was coming into contact didn't have faith, um,
I can
and
imagine, yeah, Trinity wouldn't have been the most
yeah.
religious places.
No, I mean, yeah, you had a mix of people. You would have had, I
Mhm.
suppose, at that time, this is sort of the later 90s. you would have had a fair number of people coming from a faith background, but very
Yeah.
little personal commitment to it. I think probably today you'd have less people coming, fewer people from a faith background. So yeah, it was the same thing in Trinity. You were kind of being challenged, and so I really had to start thinking about this. And so I kind of went on a sort of spiritual quest. And I was kind of looking around. Well, I mean, I suppose I had two questions. I mean, the first question was, do I believe that God exists? And that's the first question. And then the second question is, well, what about Christianity? And then the various questions that come from that: Christianity, the church, etc. So I sort of went on this sort of spiritual quest, looking around different options, trying to figure out, do I really, what do I believe, And it was, at the first place, it was focused on the question of God. So I started reading pretty widely on it. I had remembered St. Thomas Aquinas, which obviously I became a Dominican in the end. That was part of that story. But he had these 5 proofs, and I was sort of aware of that. So I started reading those 5 proofs and thinking about that. I was reading some works by Richard Swinburne. He was the Nolloth Professor of Philosophy at Oxford, I think. Various other I was reading widely, and I suppose after a long time I came to the idea that, yes, I do believe that a belief in God is rational. It's something that a modern person can credibly believe, thinking the issues through. So I suppose in the midst of all this, I also, the idea that there isn't a God isn't simply an intellectual abstract. It has an effect on the person, I think. Because, as I started to think about, if there is a God, how you perceive life, and if there isn't a God, then your view of life, if you're being honest about it, it seems to me, must be pretty bleak, actually, because there is no ultimate meaning, there's no ultimate purpose. And so there's a human dimension to this sort of intellectual kind of thinking that I was doing as well. And it seemed to me that if I ended up in the position that God is simply a human construct, that that is going to have a big impact if you're honest with yourself on what you think. So I got myself into the position where I believe that God exists. So I thought, well, that would solve everything. And it made pretty much no emotional difference whatsoever. I just came to this idea, yeah, there's a God, and so what? And that sort of surprised me. I didn't really expect that. I thought that would have been the answer to kind of everything. I wasn't exactly an atheist. It wasn't that I was an atheist. It was a crisis of doubt, I guess, in that sense. But I came to this firm belief that there is a God. It didn't have an impact that I thought it would have. And so then I turned to the second question. I mean, I'm looking back and saying it was the second question. At the time, I don't think I understood it as the second question. And that is, I suppose, the question of faith and faith in Jesus Christ specifically. So I kind of went back to that again. So I was blessed with a very good experience of faith when I was growing up. I didn't have a bad experience at all. In fact, it was very, very positive. But at this time as well, a lot of scandals had started to come out in the church. And so this was beginning, I guess. And that sort of shook my faith in that aspect of things. And I suppose you're kind of questioning, the impact that has on your belief. So again, I did the sort of same thing with the question of faith. And I'm looking at, I started off looking at, can we believe the Gospels? Can we believe the Bible? Is it just something that, was changed over time? Do these stories, do they give us an accurate eyewitness account of what had happened, or are they fictions? And I suppose I did a lot of thinking about that question kind of as well, and sort of questions kind of related to that. And again, I came to the same position that, yeah, I think that actually this is, these are historical documents, because when you look at, the Gospels, there's more evidence for the Gospels than many, many other historical events, for example. And again, I thought that would be the end of the search, that I would believe that these things are true, that Jesus Christ is, it's credible to say that he's the Son of God. And that sort of brought me a step further. But I suppose what I was really missing at this stage was I suppose, the directly spiritual element of, I guess you could say, something that's directly religious, in the sense that I hadn't really asked God about any of this. All of this was kind of stuff that I was thinking about, I was reading about, but I hadn't ever really had that sort of relationship with God where I was saying, well, Lord, if you're there, reveal yourself to me, that type of a thing. And that sort of really happened, I guess, during my second year at university, where I sort of really went on the spiritual quest in a directly spiritual sense rather than in an intellectual quest to understand faith and God. And it's there really that I suppose I came to a deep understanding of faith, that yes, I believe these things, but that I'm going to act on them and give my life to God in a fuller way. And I suppose that really was the tipping point in my own faith journey, where it was something that I can't really describe in a systematic way, because I think it was something that was really, spiritual. So I suppose that's how I started the journey to becoming a Dominican. I think those events were the core events that laid the foundation stone for becoming a Dominican later. And it was, of course, curious because I was at Trinity going in this spiritual quest towards God, while all of my contemporaries were going precisely the other way.
The other direction.
and rejecting belief in God, even though I'd say still at that time the majority had some type of religious background. It would have been relatively rare for someone at Trinity to have had no religious background at all, I would have said, But so I was going one way. Most people, not everybody, but most people were going the other way. I guess it was that real time of change in Ireland. So yeah, that was the sort of the basis of where I kind of went from at that stage.
Yeah, wow, man. Thank you for sharing that. There's so much in there that like so many valuable things. I think in terms of your own like positive experience with faith, Connor had a similar story, I think, in terms of like having a very positive Catholic upbringing that kind of endeared him to it in a way. Because I know a lot of people have a Catholic upbringing and that's kind of like the horror show. Like they just remember being bored in mass and they're just like trying to get away from that desperately and just like they're not interested. So it seems like having a positive early experience can really like it pays dividends down the line in some sense. Like
I think so. I mean, we had good priests in our parish growing up, and there were never any difficulties with them. And I suppose what impressed me about the church is that if something happened in the community, it was very often people from the church that stepped in. And if someone was sick, the church was there in the middle of it. So you had that experience of practical religion in action, where people were living out their faith in a very practical, down to earth kind of way. And some of those people would have been highly educated, and others would have had very elementary education, but their faith made a difference in how they acted. And that was my experience growing up. I didn't experience Catholicism as something oppressive. You hear people saying that wasn't my experience. And to be honest, I think even for those of my contemporaries, well, from I suppose school or from home, who maybe didn't end up continuing with the faith, I think few of them would have really said that they experienced that they experienced Catholicism as something kind of oppressive. That was something I found when I came to Trinity. I heard people saying this, but I can't really say that I experienced it, and I can't say that people that I knew who didn't go on to become lifelong Catholics, I don't think that was their experience as well. So I guess there are probably people have different experiences depending on the local circumstances, perhaps, to some extent.
And I also think if you don't understand something and you're kind of just forced to do it and there are these questions around it, it could feel oppressive in some way. Of like retrospectively you could look back and be like, I was tricked or I was duped because you don't believe it in the first place. Like that's it, really, whether or not you think it's true. Like if it is true, it's like you're getting super valuable moral formation and community and all these things. Whereas if it's not true, you're being manipulated, you're being lied to, you're being like you're part of a cult if it's not true. But so it really is that question of like the truth. And And you said, yeah, because you said there was cracks emerging whenever you were younger. Do you think, was that just like this intellectual conversation encroaching a little bit? Like people were becoming more aware of that? Do you think that was the
I
cracks that were emerging, or is it something else?
Not really. I think that was part of it. I don't think it was the specific cracks that I was seeing. I think what had happened really was that, I guess, a number of things. I think, as you mentioned there about people being bored during Mass, I think most people's experience of the liturgy growing up was poor. My own wasn't great either. And I think it became something that lacked intellectual substance. So it wasn't so much that, I suppose, the counter arguments to Christianity were coming in and overcoming the Christian argument. It's the fact that those arguments weren't there at all. So when you were at school and you were studying religion, it was almost purely ethical about being good to other people, which is a good thing. But the reality is there are people that are atheists and agnostics that are good to other people as well. And so what I think was really happening is that there was a lack of, I would say, meat, a lack of strength in the presentation of the faith, and that people ended up sort of thinking, well, it doesn't have very much to offer, because my sense growing up was that people were not offered, I guess, the fullness of the tradition of the church, in the sense of, the sort of the intellectual tradition or the credibility of the faith as the root, and that religion had become a little bit watered down in a certain sense. And now maybe that was a necessary corrective for an overemphasis on certain practices that had gone before that. I don't know, but I think that most people that I knew sort of felt that it was a bit watered down. And that's not to sort of suggest that faith needs to be a sort of a very fundamentalist type of thing, not at all. But at the same time, if there isn't a certain, I guess, rigor to it, it becomes uninteresting, because at school, so pretty much everyone from my school went to university. They were all intellectually, so it was a grammar school, so it was academically selective. So people were intellectually capable, and those were the questions they had, but those were not questions that were ever really addressed. So, of course, those people, the majority of people from school, would have gone to university in Scotland, primarily, in England, and they would have encountered arguments against Christianity, but they would have had no basis on which to say, well, hang on a minute, I think that, maybe it's not as simple as that. So I'd say that was the sort of cracks that I was seeing growing up. Now, later, I was aware of different things, but yeah.
Yes, yeah, that was kind of it was I've heard Bishop Barron describe it as beige Catholicism.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
he
yeah,
seems to attribute it to a kind of misinterpretation of Vatican II, um, that led to a more trying to make it more palatable to people in some sense, but that involved actually making it less demanding than it appeared, which actually had the opposite effect, if I'm quoting correctly. But
yeah.
yeah, that definitely seems to have played a role in it. But yeah, little commitment, and then you mentioned also being in the north. I wondered, I mean, does that factor into it a little bit, that there's a political element there of like the um northern face of Catholics and Protestants? Is faith different, do you think, in the northern variety because of the conflict there? Sorry, I don't want to take us too far off topic. That was just
Yeah,
something that
no, I
was coming up.
understand. I would say that I'd say that there is a distinction. Yeah,
Mhm.
the biggest difference I would see is not necessarily the faith itself, but I
Yeah.
suppose what I noticed was that in the north there were people that were rejecting faith to some extent, but there wasn't that animosity. Whereas in the south, I found an animosity, generally speaking. Well, I mean, it
Yeah.
varied from person to person. So I would have said that most people in the north had a positive experience of faith, and I think that's possibly because during the Troubles, and this was during the Troubles, I guess the priests were leaders in many of the communities, and they were respected, and they stood up for people at times where people were finding life difficult, for
Mm.
various reasons. Perhaps there was sectarian tensions or something going on, and so the priests were generally well respected, I think, in that respect. So I think as a result of that, the Northern Catholic community, in my experience at least, didn't have that sort of animosity, and the political factors, I suppose, played into that. Whereas the political factors were in the South, where the church was very strong. It was, connected to the government in an indirect sense of it would have had an influence at certain times in the history anyway. That didn't exist in the North, and so I
Yeah.
suppose the trajectory was different in terms of how I would say people experienced faith. I don't think it was much different in any intellectual or practical sense, but I think the political context shaped how people perceive the church, which probably has a difference. And I think you still see the legacy of that. I mean, I don't know the statistics, but my sense is that practice of the faith remains significantly higher in the North in general than in the South.
That's something that was kind of what I was getting at, I think, because that will be my impression as well, that it seemed more in the South and more animosity for sure, like a quicker rejection, possibly to do with the institutions as well, and the church becoming so involved with the institutions, and then failures of institutions gets blamed on the church automatically because they were in charge of it. But I mean, institutions fail anyway. I mean, that's so there's more animosity maybe in the South because of that. Has been my experience anyway from what I've seen.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably true. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that made the foundation kind of work of I'd say at that stage my faith had sort of, I suppose, come full circle, where I'd come back to a fairly strong basic faith again. But I was still, it took some years to put all the other sort of pieces of the jigsaw back together, I guess.
And what was your kind of perception at that time, like in the 90s, 2000s, like the rise of the new atheists, kind of like increasing secularization of Ireland, quiet secularization? Like, what did you think of seeing that? I mean, how did that impact you?
It seemed to me that was definitely the direction of travel, but that it wasn't bringing the promises that it had made into people's lives. So it seemed to me that people were abandoning religion, and it seemed that they were abandoning something that was good and moving in a direction of something that, frankly, wasn't bringing all the benefits that they thought. So I suppose it was the time of the Celtic Tiger. Everything became very materialistic. There was a huge emphasis on wealth. And some of those things, you can exaggerate things as well. I mean, Ireland wasn't historically a very wealthy country. Those things were bringing prosperity to the country, and those things were good. But it seems to me that there's only so long that those things can really satisfy the human person. I mean, extreme poverty is stressful. So people, to be prosperous, to be reasonably well off is not a bad thing as such. But if that's all you're living for, it seemed to me, and this was part of my thinking at the time, if that's all you have to live for, it's a kind of a thin conception of life. And what I was seeing around me wasn't people that were, like, for example, like Richard Dawkins and people like that, who were very much, I don't know how you'd put it, principled new atheists. They had a certain philosophical outlook on life that they believed was true. Whereas that wasn't how I saw most people rejecting religion. It wasn't something that they enjoyed, but they weren't moving into a different philosophical outlook on life. They were simply rejecting something and moving into something that really was a sort of a culture of consumerism and materialism and I suppose a hedonism of enjoying life, living for the moment, which doesn't always last, because life is difficult and challenges come along. And that's kind of what I kind of saw at that. Because so after my time at Trinity, I went to Oxford for further studies, and then to London. So I suppose that sort of cut off my familiarity with the trajectory that Ireland was on at that time. But that's what I saw at the sort of, I suppose, around the time of the Celtic Tiger. And some of those things were good. The country was becoming wealthier. Poverty was lessening, which was good. But at the same time, it was bringing with it, I would say, a vacuum was being created in terms of values and in terms of things that really bring people lasting kind of happiness. And it didn't seem to me that people were getting happier as a result of it.
So interesting, man. Yeah, I'm slightly obsessed with the Celtic Tiger, to be honest, in terms of the kind of spiritual like element of it, because it's almost like, yeah, you throw out God, and it's like, well, what fills its place? You know, like that kind of Augustinian idea of like you have to have something at the top of the value hierarchy, and if you throw out God, you're going to put something else there. And in that case, we really put like money, prosperity, the kind of material well-being, and like to such a degree where it became so unstable. Like it was almost this crazy situation of like the people are addicted to the credit, the banks are addicted to the credit, the government's turning a blind eye on it, and then it almost like blows up like like a kind of some kind of bodily disease or something, where it was just like it had been allowed to accelerate so much because there was nothing pumping the brakes. Like there was no values constraining our desires anymore. And so why don't they just run out? And I think even though we did that and we got in trouble for that, I think we're just doing it again, to be honest, with a lot of the tech stuff. I mean, that's my job as a tech ethicist. It's just like, that's all just manipulation of desire. It's hedonism,
Yeah,
essentially. Like,
yeah, yeah,
and we're doing it in a similar, and it's like, I think if we don't put God back in the proper place, we'll just do that until
yeah,
until we can't do it anymore, essentially.
yeah,
So it's not that the story hasn't changed, I don't think, since the Celtic Tiger, really. We're just kind of doing it in a different way.
yeah. I think that's true. But what I think is different is that I see, and this is jumping way ahead to the sort of the current
Mm-hmm.
circumstances, but I do see in the sort of the work that I do now a
Mm-hmm.
real uptick in interest in faith again among young people.
Okay, well, hang on, you're jumping
So
ahead of me here.
that's jumping right. So so I think
Totally.
that that's it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, so
That's yeah.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose
I
one
think
thing that I did find interesting. So I went
yeah.
to England after that.
Yes.
I qualified as a lawyer, and I find actually, although England was quite a different religious landscape to Ireland, obviously the historical background there is Protestant, Church of England, but it's been secularized for a very long time, and
Mm-hmm.
so most people didn't have strong links to the Church of England, largely. But in a certain sense, I find a greater openness of people. If you said at the weekend, what people would ask, what did you do? You'd say you went to church, and say, what church do you go to? And they would ask questions. They may not have been particularly interested in joining themselves, but there was a certain openness that I think at the time in Ireland there was a narrowness had crept in, that it was kind of like it was fashionable to be anti-Catholic, and so anyone who kind of held those views really were, it was a sort of there was an hostility there, which I didn't experience in England, even though it was a much more secularized society. So that was an interesting kind of shift that I saw when I moved over there. So I mean, yeah. So I I finished my studies in Oxford, went down to London, and and Oxford was an interesting time for me as well, because I think it was there that I really understood the Catholic faith better, and I think that was interesting that it took me sort of coming outside of Ireland to look back at the Catholic faith, and I think it gave that distance that allowed, because I was in the middle of it before then, to really see it in a different sense with people that didn't have the same historical kind of baggage. But I remember one particular incident when I was walking. It's the Oxford Oratory. I was just walking past it one day, and I called into the church, not for any particular reason, and they were having an exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. And I hadn't really seen it done like that before. I have a feeling it might have been a 40 hours devotion. I'm not sure. But anyway, it was, the Blessed Sacrament was exposed. There were lots of candles all over the place. And I really sensed the presence of Christ in that place in a very deep way, which touched me a lot. And I really then was asking myself, well, what is it about that experience that I experienced Christ? And it was then I really started to think about the Eucharist, and to think about up until that point, I'd been putting I'd say the big pieces of the Catholic faith together the sort of the intellectual pieces, the big questions on fundamental theology of revelation, that type of thing. And now I was getting into, I suppose, a different element of it, where the pieces were beginning to come together. So that was, I think, another key moment that I would identify my own sort of life that influenced me, because it then made me interested in the idea of the Eucharist and what that means for a Catholic. So I left Oxford, went down to London, and it was there really I was working in the city. It was for one of the big City of London law firms called Slaughter and May, and it was very, very intense. You're working, crazy hours doing these sort of large sort of corporate deals. But there was a little church, well, it's not so little, but it's called St. Mary Moorfields that was beside my office. And I started going quite often at lunchtimes to daily mass. And that was kind of like a big kind of thing, because I think it kept me grounded. You're in this sort of corporate world of high finance and a very ambitious sort of culture, but yet you move from that space into this sort of transcendent space for 20 minutes at a lunchtime, quite often. And I think that was something as well that was, important for me in terms of integrating my faith into everyday life that I was living. So I find that, yeah.
I was going to say, I can't imagine there was many lawyers going to daily mass in London.
Well,
maybe it's more common than I think, but yeah, it's a very interesting contrast.
No, actually, there were quite a lot. The church was every day.
Really?
It was
that
back.
Is so interesting. I
and there was
wouldn't have
another
thought
church
that at all.
that I had gone to with some friends, had invited me a few times, St. Helens Bishopsgate, which is a Church of England, an evangelical church, and they had talks on I can't remember, a weekday, and they would have the best part of 1,000 people at them. So I find this kind of curious, because it wasn't similar to Ireland in the sense that you had this very secular culture, but yet you had what I saw was a lot of faith going on at the same time. So that was kind of an interesting change, I found.
And when did you decide then to go and actually, to adopt a religious life?
Well, that's
and leave
still
the law
quite a few years to go after that. So
yeah.
I continue. I was I guess I bought into the whole idea of the Celtic tiger thing. So I was very ambitious, and I worked very hard. So I was in this firm, Slaughter and May. It's kind of one of the big kind of corporate M&A, mergers and acquisitions firm. So I was specializing in mergers and acquisitions and equity capital markets. So I was doing that. I then joined another firm called Norton Rose Fulbright, which is one of the sort of the big international law firms. And then I sort of I started moving around a lot. So I moved first to Dubai. So I was spending time there. I was in Hong Kong and South Africa, back in Europe, back in London, back to Dubai. I spent a bit of time in Saudi Arabia, a bit of time in Abu Dhabi. And most of my work was cross-border mergers and acquisitions. So my whole career was spent sort of traveling around. Most of my clients, actually all of my clients, were either governments or large corporations, mostly listed corporations. And you were doing sort of high-value mergers and acquisitions deals. So they were usually in the hundreds of millions, sometimes the billions of dollars. So it's a very intense life where you're working round the clock, you're on call all the time, you're working weekends, you're constantly traveling. So as I said, I was super focused, which with hindsight, I think was not the right thing. It's not something I would recommend to someone. But to succeed in that world, that's what you have to do. And I became a partner in Norton Rose Fulbright when I was, I think, only 7 years qualified, which was young to become a partner. Normally it's 12 to 15 years. And so I guess I had been very, very focused. I had worked to achieve this goal. I became a partner, as I say, I can't remember what age I was, but I was young anyway. And, and you're earning huge amounts of money in these sort of firms. And I kind of got to that stage and I thought, I heard I got through the partnership process, and then it was like a complete anticlimax. I thought, I'm not even sure that this kind of means that much to me. And in fact, I was pretty sure it didn't, because, at that time when I was made a partner, I was living in Dubai, and it was a very sort of luxurious lifestyle. So the people my friends, everyone was, it was, people were spending money like, because it was sort of a chandeliers in the kitchen type of environment where it was a very affluent life. But the thing I noticed, that I had got involved in the church and in Dubai, and Dubai is a very unequal society. So you have extreme wealth on the one hand, but at the same time you have extreme poverty. And in the church, it was the one place in Dubai that I found that you found both. You found people that were very well off, and you found people that were, earning $100 a month as a construction worker or something. And in some strange way, those people were coming together in the church. And I was finding that the thing that I found most life-giving wasn't sort of, eating out in great restaurants and flying off somewhere. So yeah, so I guess I was kind of, living a very, very good lifestyle. But I found, in the church, that was the one place where the rich in Dubai and the poor in Dubai were coming together. And I found that was more life-giving to me than the experience of corporate law. As well as that, you're working killing hours. I mean, you would rarely finish work before 9 in the evening, and usually more than that. So I really began to get disillusioned with it, even though it wasn't that obvious to people that would have known me at the time. And it wasn't something that I was kind of consciously saying, but I could see that I wasn't, my heart wasn't in it in the same way as when I'd been a junior associate or a senior associate aiming for partnership. And again, I think it was coming back to that idea of faith. I just sort of thought there are bigger things and more interesting things in life than the life that I'm living, where I'm giving up pretty much all of my time for a career. So I started really to question that. And then at that time, I took ill. I have a form of spina bifida, which is not terribly. It's not the most serious form, but there are some kind of complications I've had over the years with it. And one of those was that I had sort of benign tumors on the spinal cord, which were growing, and they were creating a lot of neurological problems. So I had to kind of go back home to have it assessed, and I needed fairly major surgery to deal with these kind of I can't remember the technical term, but these type of tumor type of growths on the spinal cord. And so I was off work for 6 months because I couldn't really walk properly afterwards for a long time. And but it was then that I really just sort of thought, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? I mean, what is it that is most important to me? What's most valuable? And I was kind of really thinking corporate law is not that thing. And that seemed pretty clear to me. And so I went back to work after, and I worked for another couple of years. But it was at that stage I thought, this is not what I want to spend my life doing, even though I had everything that you would normally want out of life. And I'm not saying those were bad things, but for me, they were not fulfilling. But what I did find fulfilling, and what continued to capture my interest, was faith, was Christ, was the church, and all of this sort of thing. So I decided that I would leave the partnership. I took a sabbatical effectively, but I knew that I wasn't sort of coming back really. So I took some time off to think about what I wanted to do for I suppose the rest of my life is maybe exaggerating the thing, but I just knew that I didn't want to do corporate law anymore. So I took a sabbatical. I went to Spain. I wanted to learn Spanish. And I started to really kind of think about the idea of priesthood, and religious life kind of really came back to me at this stage. So when I had been younger, I'd been interested in being a priest. And that came and went over the years. I'd explored it in more detail when I was in my sort of mid-20s. As a teenager, I'd been interested in it. But it was something that never quite left. And it came back to me again and again. And this time, I suppose I was living in Spain, and I had time for the first time in a long time to really think about the direction of my life and what was important and what was most valuable to me. And really, I started praying about it more, and it was just the same thing came back again. And I knew it was something going to be connected to the church and to priesthood specifically. So when I had been at Oxford, I had met the Dominicans there, for the first time. And what I noticed there, compared to what I'd seen in Ireland at least, is that the Dominicans there were engaging in the intellectual life of the university. They were engaging in a lot of these debates and, attempting to answer questions that I had, that young people had at the time, in a way that I found kind of interesting. And so from that point, I had always kind of had an interest in the Dominican spirituality, because I guess they were engaged in a lot of those contemporary questions that people have. And so it was then I was living in Spain, and I decided to investigate this issue a bit more. And I didn't want to be a diocesan priest. And so I contacted the Dominicans, and that's how I sort of got involved there.
And what year was it that you started with
So
the
this was
Dominican?
2020. I joined the order in 2017. So this was
Mm-hmm.
2016. I was living in Spain. So I started to think about it more kind of seriously, and I got in touch with the vocations director at the time, and he was very positive, and I guess I didn't end up looking around a whole load of different orders, because when I met the Dominicans, you meet the brothers as well, and I found them interesting, and I thought, yeah, I could live with these people. Now there's a sense in which there's also is it a natural fit as well. And so that was,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, the two elements. I suppose the attraction to the charism, and also the natural fit. And then on the charism, I suppose that idea, we're the order of preachers, formally
Mm-hmm.
speaking, is the formal title of the order. And that idea that you share the gospel with people in the world is important, because I think that we have something to offer, that's something that is of value to people and that can have a real impact on people's lives. And for me, that's something I'm eager to share with people. And so I guess that's at the core of our preaching mission. There's obviously the formal type of preaching where you're standing in a pulpit and preaching in that sense, but in a much broader sense, it's about making Christ better known and presenting to people reasons for belief, and the credibility of the faith. A lot of those issues that have been important to me as a younger man.
Mm. And was there anything in the culture in like 2016? I kind of think like that for me anyway was the start of like Jordan Peterson, that kind of Jonathan Pajot, the internet kind of response to a lot of the new atheism, that suddenly it was like people were actually having conversations about Christianity again online, that was like it was like very intellectually rigorous, and there was this kind of a slight turning, I think, going on. For me personally anyway, I suppose for other people, but yeah, I wonder, were you tuned into that? Was that something that was going on for you?
No. I
You were just
became
doing it
aware of
independently.
yeah, I was just going against the grain. I became more aware of it later, actually, than at the time. But I would say no, it had no
Yeah.
influence on me.
Yes.
It may
Okay.
have had an influence in an unconscious way.
Hmm.
But I suppose a lot of the thinking that people like, as you say, Peterson and others were kind of doing, challenging, I guess, an agnostic or an atheistic sort of consensus. I had been interested in those issues kind of a long time earlier. And so I'd followed
Yeah.
my own trajectory. I was still doing reading on all sorts of things. But I guess I probably wasn't. I think because I was working so intensely, I really wasn't following stuff on the internet, actually, to be honest. I read the news
Fair.
on the internet, and that was pretty much it. So I wasn't really up to date
You're
with
also a little bit
that.
older as well, maybe. Like it's kind of a
Yeah,
generational thing, I think, a little bit.
it could be that as well. I suppose then when I entered the order, I became sort of more familiar with, I suppose, some of the contemporary challengers. But I guess at that stage for me, those issues had been, I don't want to say settled, because issues are never quite settled in that sense. Faith isn't a static thing. But I guess the dynamism of faith for my own life, those issues had been sort of a bit more kind of settled at an earlier
Yeah.
stage. So I wasn't so much. William Lane Craig was the only one that I can really think that was kind of doing sort of apologetics. He's obviously a Protestant, but he was doing
Mm.
apologetics in the public sphere. That I remember, and I don't quite agree with all of his views anyway, but that I can remember at the time. But I wouldn't have been very aware of it. At that stage for me, it had become less about, I suppose, the proofs of Christianity and that type of thinking, and more sort of the desire for a spiritual life, I suppose, was the stronger thing that was going on for me at that stage. But then, yeah, obviously, when I entered the order, you were then, I suppose, focused on this way of life, and you became aware of thinkers out there and people that were, challenging the consensus of the new atheism. And I do think that, as you say, I think that did shift a turning point, because what you see now is, the thinkers that would have been very, very strong and almost unchallengeable when I was thinking about that, suddenly then, you've had, Richard Dawkins declare himself to be a cultural Christian, which when I remember Dawkins in his heyday, and I heard him speak live a few times, he would never have said that, as far as I could tell. That would have been a definite no-no, because it would have admitted he has a sort of a Nietzschean sort of view, in the sense that I think it would have involved admitting that there was some cultural merit in Christianity. So I did definitely see that shift, but I think you're right. It probably was around that time, but I wouldn't say it had a huge influence on me at that stage.
Yeah. And you'd say, so you mentioned like two things in terms of like the intellectual argument. That's like, okay, once you tick those boxes in some sense, it's like, all right, the ontology, I'm okay with that. But that doesn't really, that's not the thing that makes the big difference in a sense. Like the direct spiritual element, to kind of encounter with the divine, or with kind of, did you find in your training, like in entering the religious order, did that emphasize that aspect more for you? Did that cause was that beneficial, I suppose, to that direct encounter relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in our life, it's the balance of both. So I guess the Dominican life, I suppose we have an intellectual charism to some extent as well, and very strong tradition of Thomism and the thought of Thomas Aquinas and the tradition that follows him. So I suppose there is a strong emphasis, and we've been blessed in the order, including here in Ireland, with men that are gifted in that sense. So that's going on. But at the same time, we live the regular life, which is the life where, you have, lauds, midday prayer, office of readings, vespers, compline, and that takes priority. And so that you're constantly moving in and out of, I suppose, the spiritual dimension of your life, the study dimension of your life. And for Dominicans, we have regular observances, and study is one of our regular observances that Dominicans are obliged to study, not to pass exams, but to equip yourself for the preaching of the gospel, so that you're not some sort of out-of-date duffer that is not up to date with what's happening. It doesn't mean to say that everybody's going to be an expert on everything. But yeah, so I would say that in the Dominican life, certainly for the first year, it was a very much a spiritual focus. The novitiate year is a spiritual year. And then when you enter the student house in Dublin, it moves between the two things. But what you do find is that one thing feeds off another. So when you're, studying, let's say, the Trinity, that should impact on your spiritual life as well, because you're getting to know God better. You're getting to know who God is. When you study Christology, the nature of Christ, you're understanding something more about this God-man, and that should have an impact on your spiritual life. And so the two things, it should be like a symbiosis, if you like, of the things feeding off each other, I would say.
And so yeah, so now I suppose, yeah, we're kind of at the point where it's like, yeah, you're in the religious order, you're practicing, you're preaching, and have you seen in recent times, I suppose, the kind of revival of faith, the kind of quiet revival that's been going on, like versus before when you would have been growing up? Like, what's the kind of counterbalance, do you think, between like what you're seeing now and then what you saw kind of in those earlier days?
Yeah, I'd say the first time I really sort of started to see it, I suppose I would have said that, and part of it, I suppose I'd been out of Ireland for a while, and so I was coming, back into it, and it had changed in those years enormously. So I was then starting to sort of get reacquainted, at least with Southern Ireland, and I would say up until sort of the COVID time, I hadn't sort of seen sort of, too much, or wasn't aware of it. But I first became aware of it. I was spending some time living in Toulouse with our brothers there, and I did a week of apostolate. There was about 20 young adults, and it was there was a faith formation kind of program, and I was helping with it. But what really, really struck me in France was, of the 20 adults, only one of them had been baptized as an infant. The others had been baptized as teenagers. Some of them were catechumens preparing for baptism, and some, they were all in their early 20s or thereabouts. And that really made me curious about what was happening in France. And I sort of, started to explore that a little bit more and became aware of this thing in France where people with no background in Christianity were coming to faith through their experience, effectively, of a deeply secularized culture, which they have found wanting, essentially. And so that was the first time I really noticed it in person. And then when I came back to Ireland, I started seeing this same thing where people, so I guess when I had been first thinking about those issues, the vast majority of people had some faith background, who were Irish at least. They had a faith background relatively close to them. Whereas now you were finding people that had no faith background at all. They were starting to come to Mass. They were inquiring. They were asking questions. I remember once a friend of mine asked, would I meet a guy? He had some questions about faith and doubt and this type of thing. And so he came into our priory at St. Saviour's, and we had a long conversation about faith. It was really all about Cartesian doubt in the end of the day. But so we did all of that. And I met him again actually quite recently, and I discovered then he had become a Catholic since that. And so that's just an example. But I've seen many such cases in recent times of people either coming back to faith, they perhaps had been baptized or confirmed as a child, but also people with no real background. And I would say that I'd say it's probably less than it is in other places in Ireland, but it's a definite shift in what I see. And I think that what you see is that when these younger people mostly, that are coming into faith, they're looking for, I would say, the fullness of the faith. They're looking for, a rigorous kind of intellectual tradition. And they're looking for answers. They're questioning because they're living in a society where other people are going to be asking them those questions. So so I definitely do see a shift in my own sort of anecdotal experience of, things like, I met you at Evangelium, groups like that I'm involved in around the country. I meet, young people like yourself that, their faith journey has not been the standard, traditional Catholic, way of being brought up as Catholic and continuing in that. So that's been very, very interesting. And I think a lot of that comes out from the experience of living in a world that is not offering people the answers to their deepest questions. And I think that's fundamentally what it's connected to.
Yes, yeah, and that's so interesting. Like that, it's a kind of like a sense that people are going to eventually get, if the secular world isn't meeting those needs in some sense, they're going to look elsewhere. And, some of the places people look, I think, are bad in terms of like political extremism or, different kinds of tribalism or other ways they fit in. But I think, there is a real hunger again for it. And I mean, I'm a prime example of it being like, I've only realized how weird I am, I suppose, after getting baptized as well, of being like, there was, I was unrelatable as an atheist, and then I get baptized. I'm like, oh yeah, nobody else had that either. Like everybody I know was baptized or kind of had something, but like, being like completely without religion is very unusual. Even based on what I've seen, but more common now than ever before. Where you have 25% of people are technically nuns, have no religion, and so becoming more relevant.
I think it's the experience of the modern world, but also I guess people are thinking. So it's not just that they've had an emotional kind of bad experience. So and as you say, people do go. I mean, I suppose that's what St. Thomas Aquinas talks about a lot. People are always searching for happiness. That's the fundamental driver of human action, and that even the heroin addict is looking for happiness in the heroin fix. He's looking in the wrong place. But out of that experience, but also sort of intellectually, people have questions about the meaning of life, even if life is going well. So it's not that. I remember once I went to the Franciscan Sisters of the Renewal in Drogheda. They run a youth club. They're great sisters, and so they invited me to speak at their youth club. And I asked the kids, why do you think anyone becomes a religious? So this one little girl, she put up her hand and said, because your life fell apart and you had nothing else to live for. And I'm like, well, no, not really, for nothing. So it was an interesting
Maybe,
insight
but
into how people see religious, number one.
yeah, I know a lot of people that would give that answer, to be honest.
Yeah. So I thought, well, that might be true for some people. It's not true for everyone. But I think it is also that sort of, even when people's lives, I mean, I didn't give up my career and everything else because I was deeply unhappy. I mean, I was restless with it, but I wasn't, I wasn't miserable. Life was going well. So it's, so people are looking at things from a different, it's not just satisfying an emotional need. It's a much bigger thing than that. And it's also looking at reality and asking yourself the question is this true? Is it true that there is no God? Or, where have all these things come from? So there is that intellectual kind of quest that's going on as well. So but it's always individual. People's stories are different. So, that depends on the person.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned like the direct spiritual element, which I was talking about, but like that encounter, because for me, I started doing that as well, kind of through IFS work. I don't know if you know that, internal family systems therapy. It's a type of therapy,
I don't
but
know.
you essentially speak to parts, like you kind of like turn your aspects of your psychology as characters and things like that, and you do parts work, and you have
Okay.
it's kind of like an imaginal exercise that they do in therapy, and then through that, there's also like guardian spirit, and then you're kind of interacting with beings that are extra personal beings in some sense, and you're like, yeah, this is getting pretty weird. And then there's the encountering, I suppose, of higher beings, and then in IFS now there's like a lot of great IFS psychologists that are talking about demons. They're talking about unattached burdens that they essentially encounter with people while doing IFS therapy, of being like, I'm not a part of this person. I'm here to destroy them. And, you're going to have to get rid of me. And so this type of exercise that would have been very familiar to ancient people would have made perfect sense of like, our minds aren't, a fortress. There are other influencing things that we can interact with, good ones and bad ones.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a way for like modern secular people to start to experience God, and also, angels, other things in the hierarchy? Because like, I kind of think we need this experience in a sense to
Yeah.
ground
Yeah.
it. You know what I mean? Like, it can't just be the
Yeah.
intellectual arguments, but like, how do you get that
Yeah.
experience? Like, if you were recommending it to somebody.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right in the sense that I think that partly because the culture has shifted as well, that experience of God is so vital, and I think that is one of the reasons I think for much of contemporary atheism, in the sense that our society is, I suppose, it's constructed in such a way that it's very, very difficult to experience the divine in the modern world. So if you, for example, compare
Yeah.
that to someone living in the medieval era, I suppose the taste of eternity would have been easily accessible. And in our modern world, it's not easily accessible. So I don't have a simple answer to that. How would someone experience the divine? I think what I see is that very often people experience a dissatisfaction with modern culture, and then on the basis of that, they look for the divine. But it's one of the areas that I think that really needs sort of attention in the church. So one of the things I think is that when someone comes to mass, to the liturgy, because very often if someone is seeking, particularly in Ireland, they may look online and then they may attend mass. And what they should experience there, at least, particularly in the sort of Sunday mass, is something that where the senses allow them to experience the transcendent, and that it opens a glimpse for them of another world and of a better world. And of course, that's, you're dealing there with symbol and everything else. But I think that's why
Yep.
the Catholic liturgy, and why you do find an attraction to the Catholic liturgy among many younger people, is that if it's done well, that can open up, I suppose, the mind to the transcendent. But I would say outside of that, and it doesn't always happen there either, but outside of that, I suppose it's people's experiences of meeting someone with faith that can point them to that. But I think in terms of easily, I'm not familiar with the IFS therapy that you've discussed, but I would say it's probably very difficult in the modern world to have those type of experiences, and I don't think they're readily available. But sometimes people do experience something of that transcendent in nature. They see that, when they're, in the mountains or by the sea or something like that. It causes them to think about something beyond themselves. So I'd say that's probably the closest we get.
Yes, because it was such a problem for me, because like now I can see the mass as a transcendent experience, and even having knowledge of some of the tradition, and the mass is heaven and earth, and it's like rooting and the book of Revelation, and I can really have that experience. But the past me wouldn't have been able to have that experience, in a sense. Like there would have been all these obstacles and barriers. Even if that was occurring, I wasn't in a state to be able to actually perceive that. And so I've been on this kind of stumbling journey of like, how did I unwind that? But like, how could you actually systematize that for modern people to allow them to actually re-enter, in a sense? Like, I guess like prayer, self-denial, fasting probably helps. A lot of people, I think, are using like psychedelics or like imaginal practices, and very unstable things probably that aren't necessarily good. But like, I kind of think there needs to be some way for helping modern people to see that divine again.
I think it's where you would see it. So, for example, even if you're not well disposed, but if you go into a church that is beautiful, I think beauty has an important
Beauty,
role to play here. So the beauty of, architecture, and of course, you're not going to find this in every church. The beauty of the music, those things can, and the way the liturgy is carried out, those things can point people in the direction of God, even when they themselves are not, aware that it's heaven on earth and all of this type of, they have no theological construct. But the beauty is, if you like, a doorway into the divine. And so, for example, like people go all the time to classical music concerts or even sacred music concerts that are not in churches, and they listen to music which transports them. And so I think the recovery of beauty in the Catholic faith is of enormous importance for allowing people to glimpse the divine. Now that's not going to be the case on an everyday level, and parishes down the countryside are possibly not able to do all of those things. So I think, as you say, it's the other experiences that can point people. I think ascetical practices are interesting. I mean, I saw something recently that the Orthodox in America, they've attracted some converts because it's seen as a kind of a demanding faith in terms of its ascetical practices. Now, I think you could have the risk there that asceticism becomes an end in itself, whereas it's really only designed insofar as it brings you closer to God. But I mean, one of the great practices, which is not very much used nowadays, but Loch Derg, for example, as a pilgrimage, is
I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, I mean, I've had very good experiences there. So not many people are willing to do that. But if you look at hiking is popular, but then you look at the idea of pilgrimage has resurfaced again. Croagh Patrick is always busy. So people aren't always doing it for directly spiritual reasons. But I suppose our task is to kind of channel that interest that they have in the concept of a pilgrimage, and point people to the divine through that, or through their ordinary experience. I think also the experiences that people have of friendship, of love, the love in their families. I think that also is a transcendent thing that people can experience, a glimpse of the divine in that. So I don't think there's one simple answer to that, but we do live in a culture which is where it's very difficult to perceive anything beyond the material, and so that's challenging.
Yes, that it's so, you need to almost create spaces for it outside of the norm. Because like in a medieval person's life, it would have been God was integrated everywhere. It was integrated politically, religiously. Your days were structured by it, like, you know. Whereas now it's the exact opposite in a sense. The faith exercises are often the odd thing out for people, compared to their normal routine. So maybe it's about making spaces for that.
Yeah, I mean, I
People
think
can participate.
Bishop Eric Varden, I don't know if you've come across him. He's a wonderful writer, and he writes about this idea that we need to have some type of experience of the faith, because that is how most people today experience life, through their experiences, and so it is creating those opportunities where people can, experience that dimension of their lives.
Yeah, well, we've gone a little bit over here, but there was one question I had for you though, which is that imagine if you were a Catholic personal trainer and you've got somebody that's born Catholic but has fallen out of faith. They're kind of maybe getting a little bit curious about it now. What would you recommend starting with to get back into it? Like what would you say to them?
I think, well, I think it depends on the person. So the first thing I would do is really sort of see what type of person this is. Is he a reader? Is he someone who likes kind of, internet stuff? And then sort of see what, I guess, is his motivation, and what is it that is motivating his interest in faith. So that'd be the first thing I would kind of try and sort of see what is there. But if you want to just put it in a general sense, I would say getting to know other Catholics is crucial. Because one of the problems in Ireland is that very often Catholics can be a little bit isolated at a younger age group. There's maybe not many people practicing, and when you meet other Catholics who are interested in their faith, it's a sort of an iron sharpening iron kind of a thing. It causes you to think, and it can be a stimulating kind of thing. I think prayer is essential to try to pray. And prayer, I think sometimes people imagine that prayer is like taking a warm bath. It's very easy. It's a beautiful experience. But very often prayer can be quite difficult for people. So I think that, wrestling with those things and actually really, getting stuck into it, I think in prayer is vital, because I really believe that if you ask God for something, he will answer it. So, you've got to ask in the first place. I would think getting involved in the life of the church in terms of Mass, even when it's not maybe done with all the beauty and all the rest of it, but just learning about the faith. And when you learn more about the faith, it should set your heart on fire for Christ. Reading your Bible, when you read the Gospels. I mean, I remember I was studying in Rome last year, and I was doing a course in the Gospel of St. John, and it just sort of brought everything completely alive again for a gospel that I had already read a number of times. So I think those things set the heart on fire, because God's grace is already working in the person that is coming to you asking that question. And so, the more they delve into it, the more God's grace is going to kind of continue to work and to draw them into that mystery. So yeah, so I'd say those are the kind of the things. It would depend on the person to some extent as well, though.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Thank you very much, Benedict, for your time. Is there anywhere you'd like people to go or anything, or check out? If they're interested. I know the Dominicans are on YouTube.
The Dominican website. I'm the vocations director, so the vocations page on the Dominican website, because we're always looking for new men. But I think I would say that of sort of contemporary resources, I think you mentioned them earlier, but I think Robert Barron's Word on Fire is probably the best sort of comprehensive online resource that's accessible, but it's pitched at a level that is kind of challenging at the same time. I'd say that's probably, of all of the resources that I've seen, I think it's a place that is really kind of very, very useful and fruitful for people to kind of look at.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you very much.